Hello, and thank you for joining the Careers and Employability Services Introduction to the Top 10 Employability Skills. These employability skills have been identified as being of most importance by graduate employers, and that goes across all job sectors. So in the following short video, we'll be looking at one of those top 10 key skills. In this case, it's self-reflection. As you can see on the screen, we've called the top 10 employability skills GAME, which essentially stands for Graduate Attributes Matrix for Employability. So here we have the GAME icon. You may well come across this as you go through your studies if you haven't already. And this is the top 10 skills, as we mentioned before. And self-reflection is very much, or self-awareness is very much a central focus within that. But as I've mentioned in previous webinars, it's very much the case that these top 10 skills work together. They don't work in isolation. You often need one in order to develop your skills in another area. Okay, so we're going to look at, well, why is self-awareness or self-reflection a really important skill, and why do employers seek evidence and examples of this from you? And it's really quite important for employers, graduate employers especially, but really all job sectors demand a workforce that has that level of self-awareness. And that's for several reasons. One of the main reasons is it makes for a happier and more productive workforce, quite simply. So when you have that level of self-awareness of how you operate, how you work, that obviously has an impact on how others also, and your awareness of how others work is often highlighted as a particular skill from having a high level of self-awareness. It also helps you to manage your own emotions within the workplace as well. So that you can, work effectively with others, and it can affect in a positive way your communication skills, your problem-solving skills, and has a knock-on effect in a positive way in that way as well. So what can you do to develop your self-awareness or self-reflection skills? Well, first of all, identify perhaps key opportunities that you're already involved with. In order to use that as an avenue to sit down and think, well, what am I developing? What am I showing in this particular example I'm focused on at the moment? It's also a chance for you to identify gaps of where you might want to, develop certain skill areas. So you might think about taking on extra responsibilities in your current workplace, or as a project perhaps that you could provide more input into. And these are all very important because it gives you an opportunity to really think about and reflect on your impact and your input into certain activities, but also gives you a lot of information and evidence to demonstrate your skills to an employer in the future. So think about how you can improve, not just yourself, but also perhaps your immediate team or the organization that you are working with at the moment. And this doesn't need to be a huge, huge challenge. It could be on a very small level. It might be that you can bring certain skills or certain information that currently isn't being used. It might be that you've got a slightly better way or faster way of doing certain tasks within what's happening in your workplace, perhaps at the moment, or project that you might be working on. But the key thing is keep a log, because we often think, well, I'll remember that and I know I did that. But when it comes down to it and somebody actually asks you, you can't be too forward with the information. It just doesn't seem to come to the fore at the time when you need it. So do keep a log, record what you did, record how it was done, and record what came from it. What impact or input or change did it have for you, for others, colleagues, or the task itself? This will be very, very useful for you looking forward. And do ask others, ask your colleagues, ask your fellow students, ask your lecturers, ask your, supervisors at work for for feedback really on you, and also what areas they think you're strong in, but also maybe areas for development. Often people don't volunteer this information, but it can be very interesting when people do, but you often need to prompt to get that level of information. Okay. So always get involved is the key thing. What opportunities are there out there for you to get involved with? If you haven't had much work experience, and that's perfectly fine, there's lots of opportunities for you to get that project-based work experience. Here's a few examples on the screen now. It's not exclusive. There's loads and loads out there. These are just ones which are either on your doorstep or you have easy access to. Okay. So think about events, think about workshops, think about networking, conferences or events and things like that. All of these are easily found on some of the options that are thrown up on the screen for you now. There's also learning opportunities, training, certification, licenses that you can tap into, which demonstrate your eagerness to learn. And yeah, it can be a very, very positive thing to be bringing forward within any application in the future, and a good way of demonstrating your self-reflection, because how you write your applications will be very, very driven by your self-reflected examples that you've been involved with. Okay. So just going back a slide there. Sorry. Let's I'm just going to go back to that one. So a quick sum up of self-reflection and the key points, the key stages you might want to be thinking about here. So first of all, you need a willingness to learn. So you may well have instances already where you can look back on, and they could be very much a good avenue to be starting with, to look at a self-reflective exercise on that. You can also get more perspective on your skill level and gaps that perhaps you feel, actually, yeah, I do feel like I could improve on this particular area, or what I know I need to bring into my workplace may involve, and you can identify key ways that you can sort of develop those things as well, which in turn helps you to recognize the skills that you need most. And that might be skills for your own benefit, but also within the type of job sector that you know that you are wanting to work within. What's highly valued there, you can identify through this process of self-reflection. So it does help you with your career success and progression. So in summary, take responsibility for your own development, claim a role if you don't already have key roles, tasks that you feel you can start doing those reflective activities with. You can find opportunities through a variety of sources, including Student Hub and some of the options I gave you on screen previously. Seek challenges. So even if you're involved with projects now, are you perhaps challenging yourself? Are you looking at new areas of work, or new ways of doing things? These are really very positive avenues to explore, and works really well for a self-reflective exercise as well. Do ask for feedback off your colleagues, off your friends, off your fellow students, off your tutors, your lecturers. It's often very surprising what you get back, and it can be very, very helpful. And then you're in a good place to start looking at self-reflection. Okay, so here's some key resources which are very useful to then take your self-reflection to. So in other words, when you come to the point of applying, for example, for graduate schemes, graduate jobs. You may want to use some of these key functions and software that we have on our Student Hub. For example, CareerSet is a very, very positive tool to help you develop your cover letter and CV. So if you want to know, well, how can I put across those key learning points I've developed through my self-reflection, CareerSet will help you to put that into context in that type of CV setting. It can also help you optimize your LinkedIn profile. But I'd always suggest coming into the Careers and Employability Service following using these resources for further tailoring. Okay, so that might be you further tailoring this to your particular career sector of interest, for example. We can help with that. There's also events, workshops, training, work-based learning opportunities and things like that that you can get involved in, and they are also available on Student Hub. And we have lots of resources to help you with developing your recruitment practice and your applications and your interviews and everything else as well. So to finish off, this is our Student Hub platform. As you can see, we have lots and lots of resources on there, which include, as I mentioned there, CareerSet and CV, cover letters, events, workshops, training. We have Career Passport, which is a new package which helps you guide you through all of those different types of tasks and activities, which give you very much strong value with graduate employers. So come in and have a chat with the careers advisors. You can always book appointments as well on Student Hub directly at the appointments tab here at the top. And we look forward to seeing you sometime soon. Thank you for listening.